My task this afternoon is to discuss our efforts to eliminate torture in our country. And in the process, I will give you a crash course on Philippine politics. Hopefully, you won't sleep during my speech and it will not feel like torture. Anyway, on May 19, 2009, Filipino-American Melissa Rojas was abducted by suspected members of the military in a remote village in the central Luzon region of the Philippines, located north of Manila. Rojas was accused of being a communist rebel. After several days, Rojas was eventually released. She was able to recount her ordeal, including the torture she suffered in the hands of her captors. This is an excerpt of what Rojas mentioned in her affidavit submitted to the courts, and I quote, "Throughout my abduction, I was always blindfolded and handcuffed, even in my sleep, except for those few times when I was made to take a bath. They held my feet and my hands down, and doubled up plastic bags were pulled down on my head and face, and closed on my neck, and I started to suffocate and I could not breathe anymore. The interrogation continued non-stop, with one interrogator replaced by another after every hour, and I was not given lunch, although there was a brief respite from the questions during lunch, but it continued after lunch." End of quote. The case of Melissa Rojas received national and international attention because she is a citizen of the United States. Fortunately for us, Rojas refused to remain silent about what she endured, and she was able to summon enough courage to share her story with the rest of the world. Last April 2012, Rojas testified in Geneva to highlight the state of human rights in the Philippines. Rojas gave face to victims of torture and other human rights violations during the administration of former President Gloria Arroyo, who ruled the country from 2001 to 2010. By the time Arroyo stepped down from power last June 2010, the documented cases of torture in the country have already reached 1,099. Rojas was one of the 1,099. The surge in human rights abuses in the past decade was one of the reasons why there was a strong lobby, renewed interest, and political commitment to enact an anti-torture law. We succeeded in our legislative advocacy when President Arroyo signed Republic Act 9745, or an act penalizing torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment on November 10, 2009. I am proud to say before this body that I am one of the legislators who actively supported and voted in favor of this law. What are the pertinent provisions of this law? At this point, please refer to your dossier, page 83, because the dossier has reference to the Anti-Torture Act of 2009 of the Republic of the Philippines. On page 84 of your dossier, section 4, Acts of Torture, we identified specific cases of torture. Instead of the general definition of torture, we decided that specific acts of torture should be listed in the law so that there will be no ambiguity. Most of the torture examples here were given by torture victims themselves, because the Philippines experienced martial law for 14 years from 1972 to 1986. And then section 4, subsection B, we included mental and psychological torture. We included here number 5. Mental torture, an example of psychological torture is when preparing a prisoner for a show trial or public display or public humiliation of a detainee or prisoner. Why? Because our leaders, especially police generals, have this bad habit of parading suspects to the media. They're not convicts but mere suspects. So we identified it as torture. Then section 6 of the law, we included here the naming of people in the order of battle of the military should not be used to torture them. Why? Because often the order of battle is used by the military to harass people and to torture innocent civilians. And then on section 8, all evidence obtained during as a result of torture will be inadmissible in the courts. And then section 10, we listed writ of amparo, habeas data, These are some of the Supreme Court legislative remedies in answer to the human rights abuses in the past decade. And Section 11, what is the innovation in Section 11? If a person can file a complaint not just with the constitutional bodies of the government, but also in our village governments and non-government organizations. And then Section 12, the state should provide medical assistance to victims of torture. And then Section 13, why is this important? Because it underscores command responsibility. Even though a superior or a senior officer can be sued in the court if he has knowledge of torture. And related also to Section 13 is, even though you are not member of the police or army, but if you are a public official and you are aware of torture, and if you hid these cases of torture, you can be sued in the court. And this provision was used to sue former President Gloria Arroyo, the AntiTorture Law, by the principle of command responsibility. And then Section 21, Education and Information Campaign. We decided that human rights should be integrated in our courses, in the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels. So our teachers are preparing teaching modules on how to teach human rights. Before 2 weeks ago, I heard that there was a teaching module on how to teach torture, and they cited the example of Batman the movie, in the Dark Knight film, wherein Batman went to the police station and obtained confession from Joker. So is it okay to torture Joker because he is Joker and the one who is torturing is Batman? So we used popular culture examples to teach human rights concepts. So these are some of the provisions of the Anti-Torture Law. Unfortunately, the passage of the Anti-Torture Law in 2009 didn't prevent the continued use of torture by armed personnel of the state. On February 6, 2010, just a few months after the enactment of the Anti-Torture Law, the Army arrested 43 health workers suspected of being members of the Communist New People's Army in a suburban town east of Manila. After almost a year of being placed in detention, the health workers were set free after the case against them was dismissed by the court. The health workers complained that they were subjected to physical and mental torture by their captors. During one of their court appearances, I was able to listen to their testimonies exposing the daily rituals of torture inflicted against them. A doctor testified that, and I quote, whenever they needed to urinate, a guard had to pull their shorts and other pants down, and females had their genitals washed by their guards as they were blindfolded. Electrocution and other forms of torture were also reported, end of quote. The backlash against human rights atrocities committed by state forces contributed to the unpopularity of the Arroyo government. The administration party lost badly in the 2010 elections. The overwhelming victory of the opposition raised expectations that the new leadership will review the security policies and programs of the government, which directly and indirectly encourage the military and police to commit human rights abuses against suspected supporters and sympathizers of communist rebels. After 2 years, can we say that there has been qualitative change in governance in terms of protecting human rights? Sadly, I have to answer in the negative. Human rights violations have continued even under the supposedly reformist leadership of President Benigno Aquino III. Impunity, a word which recently became popular in our country because of the government failure to punish human rights violators, persists. A few days ago, the chairperson of the Commission on Human Rights complained that not a single human rights violator has been sent to jail during the term of President Aquino. Based on the latest statistics of the Commission on Human Rights, the Commission received 261 complaints on torture from the police, perpetrated by the police, 96 by the military, and 91 by other armed groups. Most probably private armies by politicians and other political forces. Human rights abuses have intensified in the poorest regions of the country, especially where there is mining areas. Mining is now the top economic activity in the Philippines, and mining has displaced several communities. Incidentally, the communist insurgency and the Muslim separatist movement in Mindanao are strongest in these areas. Mandated to crush the rebellion at all costs, state forces failed to distinguish combatants from non-combatants in conducting their operations. Their aggressiveness can be attributed to the unrealistic deadline imposed by the national government to quell the armed movements in the country. National security policymakers advanced the doctrine that the number of rebels will dwindle if members of the legal left are prevented from doing their political and propaganda work. They made no distinction between communists who bear arms and those who chose to work in the legal arena. This new doctrine has resulted in the brutal assassination, massacre, torture, and kidnapping of non-combatant leftists and even innocent individuals. Hundreds of peasant communities suspected of being influenced by communists are subjected to food blockades and hamletting. Extrajudicial killings became so acute and widespread that the United Nations was forced to send a special rapporteur in 2007 to investigate the alleged human rights violations perpetrated by state forces. The Philippines is facing the longest communist insurgency in the world. Since 1969, the Maoist-influenced rebels has been waging a protracted people's war, and the group is still considered today the country's top security threat. Why has it survived this long? The rebels are composed mainly of poor farmers, who probably got attracted by the radical land reform program offered by the Communist Party, which involves at the minimum the reduction of land rent and abolition of usury, and at the maximum, the confiscation of landlord property and its equitable distribution to the peasants. The issue of inequitable land distribution in the provinces has fueled countless peasant uprisings across the country's 7,000 islands. Such uprisings have also forced past and present administrations to enact land reform laws, many of which have been rejected by farmer groups for being excessively in favor of landlord interest through inserted loopholes and tricks for the landlords to prevent or evade land distribution. Aquino's family, the country's incumbent president, for instance, owns the biggest family-owned farming estate in Southeast Asia, and it still remains largely intact despite the passage of a land reform law in 1987, because the Aquinos refused to distribute their vast land holdings to small farmers. The Communist Party credits its longevity to the direct and indirect support given by hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of farmers who sympathize with the communist cause, especially with its land reform program. Based on official documents on its website, the Communist Party is not yet on the threshold of clinching victory in the country. It claims to be operating at the strategic defensive phase of the protracted People's War. Its armed forces, though much smaller than the military, are strategically scattered throughout the archipelago. In short, the armed rebellion led by the Communist Party is neither winning nor losing at the moment. Despite its failure to capture state power, the Communist Party wields little and sometimes significant influence on Philippine politics. During the Marcos dictatorship from 1972 to 1986, the Communist Party played a key role in sustaining the pro-democracy movement. The party was the most consistent and formidable political force that opposed martial law during the Marcos years. It gained prestige and strength as it persevered in undermining the autocratic Marcos rule. After the downfall of Marcos, the party did not renounce its armed struggle. Peace talks were initiated between the government and the communist rebels, but they soon broke down after disagreements on the framework of the negotiations. An amnesty program was offered, but it was ineffective in encouraging the rebels to surrender their arms. A turning point in the history of the Communist Party was the rectification movement it launched during the early 1990s. The party affirmed its adherence to the Maoist line of encircling the cities from the countryside, but there were a number of cadres who disagreed with this theory and proposed an urban insurrection as a model for advancing the Philippine Revolution. There were also members of the party who wanted to embrace a peaceful transition to socialism. Furthermore, the party apologized for the brutal killing of some of its own members wrongly accused of being double agents of the government. According to the military, the rectification movement diminished the strength of the party and permanently affected the winning chances of the revolution. The party reached the peak of its military and political strength in 1986, but the internal disputes which led to the split in the 1990s have fundamentally weakened its influence in Philippine politics. For the government, The Communist Party is the major stumbling block preventing the Philippines from achieving sustained economic growth, like its more prosperous Asian neighbors. The government insists that poverty will not be eradicated and foreign investors will shy away from the country as long as communist rebels are lurking in the provinces. This mindset explains the dominance of militarist thinking in confronting the insurgency. Even after the militarist Marcos was removed from power, the generals continue to dictate the policies in dealing with the extreme left. It is inaccurate to state that peace talks, amnesty programs, and economic incentives were the tactics of the government to solve the insurgency. Since the Marcos era, the principal approach of the government in dealing with the rebellion was to use violent and repressive tools against the armed and even the unarmed members of the left. During the term of President Aquino, she renewed the peace talks with the rebels in 2001. But her attitude changed after the 9/11 terrorist attack in the United States. She started accusing communist leaders of being terrorists, which practically nixed previous attempts to end the insurgency through peace negotiations. When Aquino became president in 2010, he unveiled his so-called innovative approach in resolving the country's long insurgency problem. Patterned after the military models in the United States, the new program, dubbed as Oplan Bayanihan, provides a new framework and strategy in ending the insurgency threat. Officials of the armed forces claim that it is a counter-insurgency program that will no longer cost the lives of thousands of civilians, a program that focuses on winning the peace instead of simply defeating the enemy. The program banks on two strategies: the whole-of-nation approach, which entails a multifaceted and multi-pronged approach in solving the insurgency problem, and the people-centered security or human security approach that put people's welfare at the center of operations. Such concepts were largely based on the U.S. Interagency Coin Initiative. In other words, Oplan Bayanihan aims to end the rebellion by redirecting the energies of the army from engaging the rebels in the battlefield to participation in the delivery of basic social services in the communities. The primary concern now of the military is to win back the trust of the people, especially the poor, and restore public confidence in government institutions. Soldiers are now required to undergo human rights seminars and keep a human rights handbook while performing their duties. Members of the Philippine Army are among the most experienced and battle-tested soldiers in the world. Indeed, they need some respite after 40 years of being on active war footing against the communist guerrillas. Relying on the purely military solutions has also been proven to be a failure in defeating the insurgency. While Oplan Bayanihan admits that a purely military solution is insufficient to put an end to the insurgency, peace advocates and human rights groups are not convinced that it addresses the roots of armed conflict in the country. Basic issues at the root of the armed conflict, such as land reform, national sovereignty, social justice, and genuine democracy, remain unaddressed under the Aquino administration. Human rights groups have also expressed doubts whether the paradigm shift would address the problem of rampant human rights violations committed by the Philippine military. They cite, for instance, the continuing practice of army officials of branding legal progressive organizations as communist fronts. These human rights abuses may be the handiwork of isolated elements inside the army who want to sabotage the peace talks between the government and the communists. But some analysts fear that it could be an indication of the real strategy of the government. One hand promotes peace, while the other still enforces error. The Philippine experience with regard to human rights protection underscores the following. Number one, human rights legislation must be accompanied by sustained, coordinated, and multi-sectoral efforts to guarantee effective implementation, documentation, and monitoring of the law. Number two, awareness, information, education initiatives must begin with the bureaucracy. Number three, legislation is inadequate. In fact, it would be rendered meaningless if not supported by substantial judicial, social, and political reforms. Before I left Manila to attend this forum, the Commission on Human Rights informed this representation about their proposed interventions to further promote human rights, and in particular, prevent abuses like torture. Civil society, government institution, and the Commission can, in a real-time manner, discuss urgent cases of human rights violations, and even launch quick response actions to prevent arbitrary acts by the state security forces. And number three, in light of the Philippine adhesion to the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment last April 17, 2012, the Commission, in partnership with civil society groups, will be filing a bill which will establish a National Preventive Mechanism in the Philippines, or NPM. So after the anti-torture law, our next task is to pass this bill. National Preventive Mechanism is the OPCAT's domestic arm and main engine of the system of regular visits to places of deprivation of liberty. Not just detention facilities, but also juvenile centers, drug rehabilitation facilities, and migrant holding centers for the prevention of torture and other forms of ill-treatment. Related to this is our effort to push for an efficient witness protection system, the reform of the criminal justice system, the prosecution of human rights violators, and the continuing human rights education among our people. But for people's organizations and human rights groups working in the grassroots, the long-term solution to end torture and other human rights atrocities cannot be realized through simple bureaucratic and administrative reforms. The laws in the Philippines are in place. Legal remedies are available. Even politicians and law enforcement agencies are publicly and openly embracing human rights concepts and their deep respect for rule of law, freedom, and democracy. Yet, abuses continue. Why? Because it is impossible to mainstream human rights without adopting structural reforms in governance and the inequitable political economic system that supports it. Therefore, as we continue to enhance the legal framework in our human rights advocacy, people's organizations are also actively demanding key political measures which they think would address the roots of conflict in our country. For example, they are asking the government to resume the peace talks with the rebels. The talks are stalled because of the refusal of the government to release more than 300 political prisoners. The peace talks would allow the continuation of discussion on economic and social issues that drive many people to take up arms. The government is also urged to re-evaluate its counter-insurgency plan, which has caused tremendous suffering in poor villages and victimized thousands of innocent civilians. Instead of militarization and deployment of soldiers in communities, the government should concentrate on the delivery of basic social services in the countryside. Torture is a taboo, which is secretly endorsed and practiced by coercive elements of the state because they think it is essential to weaken their enemies. In the context of a third world society like the Philippines, unfortunately, the enemies are the people who resist government programs and development aggression projects. This makes it more imperative for the government to rethink its policies that breed tension, hate, division, and suffering. The human rights constituency must be broadened and expanded so that it can be strong enough to push for the sincere and resolute implementation of human rights laws like the anti-torture law. My concluding remarks: what are some of the lessons from the Philippines? We have the anti-torture law. We have already ratified the OPCAT. We have a witness protection law. Our realization is that our work doesn't end with enactment of laws. The bigger challenge is to implement these laws and the funding of these laws. And the more difficult question is if political leaders have the political will to adhere to the highest standards of democracy and rule of law. Finally, the best approach is to encourage the rise of a citizen movement. A citizen movement which would articulate the issues we in Parliament often try to ignore or refuse to tackle. Thank you very much and good afternoon.